This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I bet you were looking forward to that gospel today, weren't you? It sounds something like either a Brett Ratner science fiction or terrible movie, 2012 or one of those kind of things. But I would guarantee you probably none of you came to church saying, gosh, I hope we find out how they burn those guys out. The reality is that there is an elephant in the living room, if you will. There is a behavior, there's an attitude, there's a value, there's something out there that is incredibly destructive. It is the thing that is probably most destructive in the Green family. It's destructive in the choir. It's destructive in the congregation, in the city of Palm Springs. It's certainly destructive of our nation and the world as a whole. I'm talking about anxiety. When somebody is anxious, they have this need to do something. Now, I have to put a little warning in here, a proviso, because I preached a sermon some time back or years ago or maybe about 6 times that says, do something even if it's wrong. Well, that's a sermon about people who are feeling depressed and they're feeling really stuck. For those folks, do something even if it's wrong. That still holds true. But when you've got a situation where you're not actually sure what's going on, where you're not really sure who's in charge or what the next action to take is, that's what I'm talking about as anxiety. Is there anybody else that had anxiety in their family? Okay, so you're familiar, maybe just a little bit, but you're familiar with anxiety, right? And so one of the things that happens in a group, in a family, or when there's anxiety, is somebody feels the need to take charge and make decisions. Okay? And the reality is that the decisions one makes under the influence of anxiety are not necessarily always good decisions. Because, we've got a news cycle that's now like a 15-minute news cycle. It used to be a 24-hour news cycle. And so we hear things and we've got to deal with them immediately. I would suggest that anxiety didn't start with the 24-hour news cycle. I don't think anxiety even started in the 20th century. We can look at this Old Testament, this reading from the Hebrew Scriptures of Exodus, and we can see an example of really early anxiety. Look at the first line of today's lesson. When Moses was delayed in coming back, the people wondered, where is he? He's been up on that mountain. We saw the cloud, the fire. Where's Moses? What's going to happen? Oh my gosh, he's brought us out here just so we can starve in the desert. Can you see the anxiety taking over? And so Aaron, the priest, decides, I know what we need. You, take the earrings off your son. We're going to melt them down and make a god for ourselves. In response to anxiety, the people are looking for anything that they can have in front of them as a symbol that things will be the way they think they should be. Okay? And so the people found that somebody was willing to take charge in the midst of all that anxiety and do something for them. And that's all the golden calf, and lots of people were killed as a result, and it's a bad scene all around. But we get the same thing. We get a lot of that in the gospel today. We get a lot of that anxiety, and it's a challenge for us because this anxiety is in the form of a parable that's coming out of the mouth of Jesus, right? We can deal with stuff like this when it comes from Moses, but when it's Jesus, we expect better. Okay, so I want to share something with you that there are 3 versions of this gospel. There's one in Matthew, there's one in Luke, and there's one in the Gospel according to Thomas, which we don't read very often, but the Gospel according to Thomas has often very simplified and earlier versions of stories that are in the other scriptures, in the other Gospels. Well, let me give you a sense of what those other versions see as the core of this story. The king, the landowner, the important person, was giving a big feast. And months earlier, he had invited absolutely everybody who was anybody. And when it came time, like at 4:30 and the feast was at 6 o'clock, he sent folks out to say, "It's ready, y'all come." And one of them said, "I just bought a village. I've got to go collect the rents. You'll have to excuse me." Another one said, "My best friend is getting married, and I'm preparing dinner, so you're going to have to excuse me." And there was another one who said, "My cow is sick, so I'm sitting up with a sick cow, or calf, I guess, sick cow, and you're going to have to excuse me." So the servants went back to the guy who invited everybody and said, they're going out doing this, they're going out. They've all asked to be excused. Nobody's coming. And then he says, "I want my banquet hall filled for the feast. So go out and invite anybody you find to the feast, because I want to make sure that the hall is filled." And so they did. And the hall was filled. That's the heart of the story. Can you see the anxiety that's been added? Because the gospel version that we're reading is done probably a generation or a generation and a half after the time of Jesus. It's when the Christian community, which is just kind of a subgroup of the Jewish community at that time, they're trying to figure out things. Well, Jesus said he was coming back, but he's not here yet. What are we going to do? And these folks are pushing us around, and they aren't letting us in the temple anymore. What are we supposed to do? Well, one of the things you do is you tell stories saying, well, the folks who were invited didn't come, so not only did the king invite somebody else, he wiped them out, burned their city, destroyed it, and said, "Nya, nya, nya." That's what anxiety does in this story. But let's look at what the heart of the story is. The king, if you will, the ruler, the landowner, the important person, wants the banquet room filled when it's time for the meal to be served. And if folks aren't interested in coming, fine, invite somebody else, but make sure the table is full. Now, this gives us some important work to do. Our work is not to figure out who's worthy or not worthy. Our goal is not to go and make sure we burn out all those people who ditched their invitations. Our goal is simply to reach out and invite everybody we meet to the banquet so that the king's hall is full. Now, did you hear? Did any of you listen to NPR? Anybody listen to NPR besides me? On NPR this week, there was a story about mass flash mobs in Detroit. You know what the flash mobs are, right? Where a group of people kind of really practice out and show up in the middle of a square and start doing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or something like that. I wasn't involved in one of those. But in Detroit, they've started having mass mobs, where they've got a church that's having some difficulty, and they send out the word, and everybody is supposed to show up at that church on a particular Sunday at a particular time. So instead of having 15 people there, this one church, they had 1,200 show up. My hope is that they told whoever makes the bulletins. But do you see the idea? The goal is not for us to go around picking and choosing and out of anxiety trying to make sure that we can find somebody to blame for whatever's wrong. The goal is to make sure the house is full. Now, that can lead to anxiety too. Because I'm sure there are some of you who've already looked around and said, well, you know, it was fuller here last week. Why isn't it as full this week? Oh my God, what's wrong? We've got to have the house full. Why isn't it? Be at peace. St. Paul has some advice for us in dealing with this whole issue of anxiety. What does the line in the middle of today's reading from Philippians say, just after the rejoice thing? It says, don't be anxious about anything, but offer everything to God in prayer. Now notice, the next line is not, then everything's going to be all right and you'll be rich. Nobody in your family will ever die or be hurt. It doesn't say that, does it? It says, then the peace of God will be with you. So our response to anxiety is not to find somebody to be in charge or to take charge ourselves if somebody doesn't step forward quickly enough, but to offer whatever it is that we're concerned about. And concerns are real. Whether you've got a friend who's going to hospice, whether you've got a challenge in a relationship, whether you aren't one of those people that got reemployed after the financial disasters. Whatever the things are that are real concerns, it says, don't be anxious about them, but offer them up. And the God of peace will be with you. So God's desire is that the house, the table, should be filled when the meal is shared. And second, the promise is not that our lives will be perfect, not that we will never have stress or even bad things happen, but that the God of peace will be with us. Because rather than invest in anxiety and go to find something where we can be in charge and somebody to blame for whatever's wrong, we take a step back and we offer whatever on our heart up to God. And we receive that promise that the peace that passes all understanding, that's even unintelligible to us sometimes, will be with us. Now, I have to tell you, if everybody here at St. Paul's all the time, everybody in the Green family all the time was able to say, when something is stressful to us, instead of finding somebody to blame or somebody to step forward and change things, if we were able to offer it up to God, take that step back, can you imagine how much more full the table would be? Because I'd much rather go to dinner with somebody who is not always anxious than with somebody who's just looking for somebody else to blame. That's God's call to us, and that's God's promise to us today. Amen.